Thank you so much for inviting me. And what I'll try to do is lay out how I see public opinion addressing some of the main questions that we have on our mind. I was actually asked to consider Israeli and Palestinian public opinion. I will leave most of the Palestinian explanation to Noor, of course, but I want to just highlight some of the numbers that come out of joint Israeli-Palestinian public opinion research, or really I'll talk about the trends. And that's because for most of my career, I'm actually a public opinion researcher myself, and I conduct those joint surveys together with my colleague Khalil Shikaki, who is a Palestinian public opinion researcher. I'm not going to get too much into the weeds. I want to talk about the big trends. One of the interesting things that we've seen over the years is that despite a vast asymmetry of power in this conflict, we see very parallel trends in public opinion over the years in terms of how each side has felt about key issues like a two-state solution or diplomacy or the use of force or attitudes towards the other. And so I can say that after October 7th, this was obviously a turning point in public opinion. And I think the obvious trend that both sides once again displayed when we conducted our last Israeli-Palestinian public opinion survey in the summer of 2024. But even separately, the two sides had shown these trends right away within those first 6-7 months, that both sides became more hardline on everything that would, on the issues that are related to de-escalation. And so a brief example from the Palestinians is that right away we saw elevated support for Hamas, particularly in the West Bank, but also a little bit in Gaza immediately in the first survey. This was a separate Palestinian survey, also conducted by the same organization, the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. Actually, support tripled in the West Bank and rose just a little bit in Gaza. And in those first many months, very high support for the phrasing Hamas's offensive attack on October 7th, and that support was high for a long time. Both of those trends have been tempered somewhat over the last 2 years. On the Israeli side, what we saw in all of these kinds of questions that would indicate escalation or de-escalation was extremely high support, almost consensus really, on Israel's response, Israel's war in and on Gaza, with, I should say, a massive difference always between Jewish Israeli citizens and Palestinian citizens of Israel. So we, in Israeli surveys, and including in the joint Israeli-Palestinian survey, we include Palestinian citizens, or 48 Palestinians, and we count them on the Israeli side. So the average will always show a weighted average, and it's brought down by far lower support from Palestinian citizens for everything to do with escalation or war or supporting the use of force. But this is really driven by the Jewish Israeli population showing near consensus support for Israel's actions in Gaza, Israel's level of the use of force, and I mean in the early months. And those trends really went on with a couple of mitigating factors that over roughly from early 2024, probably around April, through to the declaration of a ceasefire. I would hesitate to really call it a ceasefire in October 2025. So for almost all of that time, the majority of Israelis, a consistent majority, including among the Jewish population, was supporting a ceasefire throughout that time, as opposed to only about 1/3, anywhere between 1/4 and 1/3. And here I'm drawing mainly on public surveys from the media that were consistently asking this question. So you had a majority that supported a ceasefire, which can be seen as something like a mitigating factor for the very hardline views that we saw in other ways towards Gaza. But I have to say that the reason why Israelis were supporting a ceasefire at that time, and this, by the way, was shared by Jewish Israelis and Palestinians from 1948, not at equal levels. Palestinians had a consensus support for a ceasefire, whereas among the Jewish population, it tended to be more like just over 50% or up to 60%, sometimes higher. But the reasons were not out of humanitarian concerns for Gaza or criticism of how extensive the war had become and how much of Gaza had been destroyed. It was really almost always, if you probe beyond the numbers, it was really about hostage release, and that's always how it was tested in surveys as well. The other reason why there were some mitigating factors, particularly that higher support for a ceasefire, was because Israelis had become very critical during the war in Gaza because they viewed the war as a matter of Netanyahu's political interests. And they not only were they desperate to get the hostages back, but they had come to believe that the war on Gaza, which I think that through most of this time we can credibly call it a war on Gaza, they were seeing it as something that served Netanyahu's interest and had used up even the kind of military or strategic value of destroying Hamas that Israeli Jews support. And that was driving their critique of the ongoing war at that time. It really was not about either humanitarian concerns or moral concerns. And it certainly was not due to any support for a diplomatic path towards Palestinians in general or diplomatic solutions. One of the things, the other parallel trends I should point out, is that really both Israelis and Palestinians, certainly based on the joint survey we conducted in July 2024, showed that the strong majority of both sides, really, I should say about 2/3, held the absolute worst view of the other in terms of assessing that the other side was trying to totally annihilate them. We ask actually almost an identical question about what you think the intentions of the other side are. So, almost 2/3 believe the other side was totally trying to completely destroy them. And another roughly 15 or 20% thought they were trying to mostly destroy them, or really the second most extreme view in that question. Both sides held very dehumanized views of the other based on scale, where we ask outright, how much humanity do you see in the other side? And so those were the parallels. Another divergence, however, was that Israelis displayed a decline in support for the two-state solution. And I mention the two-state solution not because it's the perfect solution or even a possible solution, but mostly because it has been a long-term kind of barometer question that we test in surveys. And we've seen the decline from a firm majority among all Israelis, including among the Jewish population, from 2010, that was a slow and steady incremental decline, losing the majority, dipping below 50% already in 2018. And at this point, among the Israeli population in total, support for a two-state solution stands only at around 30%, lower among the Jewish Israeli population, because you always have very high support from Palestinian citizens in Israel. And that is also a bit of divergence. On the Palestinian side, we've seen that support went up a little bit and has leveled out at around 40% for that solution. Again, it's a very broad question, mostly just to test changes over time. There are some expectations that the people, the public, will somehow move the government, because Israel's government is so extreme and really is filled with religious fundamentalists, towards a more conciliatory approach. I don't see that. What we did see that throughout the 2 years of the war in Gaza, that the public, the majority, were hoping for a ceasefire, again, driven by hostage release. So they were ahead of the leadership in that sense. But right now, the Israeli public, once again, driven by attitudes among the Jewish public, they're ahead of the leadership in terms of wanting more escalation. For example, on the front with Hezbollah and Lebanon, you have, according to the most recent poll from the Institute for National Security Studies, 59% of Israelis, and that's all Israelis, want greater engagement or greater intensification of Israel's actions against Hezbollah. So we know that's higher among the Jewish population. They're disappointed in the government's actions in ending the war in Iran. They were disappointed that the war didn't achieve what the prime minister had laid out as the main aims, and disappointed by the fact that a ceasefire was essentially imposed by the Trump administration. So I've been doing polling for, I think, 27 years now. And I feel pretty in touch with how Israelis think about things, but many of these things are unprecedented. And so everybody was complaining and traumatized and scared, and life was deeply disrupted because of the war in Iran. But I myself did not predict that great majorities of the Israeli Jewish public opposed the ceasefire in April. And that's mainly because they think that that war hadn't achieved the goals that the prime minister promised. So we'll talk about young people afterwards, but briefly, Israeli Jewish young people are more hardline in general than the older populations. Among 48 Palestinians, that sometimes is the case, but it's not as consistent. And in terms of changing global attitudes, we went through that in great detail, very accurately. But the one thing I would say about that is that Israelis are aware of their deteriorating position, and all the data that we just talked about gets a lot of coverage in Israel. But Israelis always attribute it to either weak hasbara, a word you now all know, which Israelis consider public diplomacy or propaganda, and they point to exactly the kind of changing information environment which they believe allows lies to spread about what Israel has done in Gaza or in other situations, global journalists that are somehow anti-Israel. And so they always attribute it to a campaign against Israel, but social media feeds that because they can look at social media and say this stuff isn't real. And so it feeds denialism, I think. And so I wouldn't expect Israeli public opinion to change because of global public opinion, but I do agree that in the long term, changing public opinion abroad can change policy slowly and surely. But we see how the Democratic Party, for example, in the US, has recently held a vote where a much more significant number voted to limit arms export, and Senator Chris Van Hollen writing a very prominent op-ed calling to de-exceptionalize America's support for Israel. So that is probably the direction of change.